So, in this episode, we're going to explore something that I believe most people, I'm trying not to say things like all people, but most people have an entanglement or a relationship with control that is rooted in some form of survival. And I'm really excited to have Rae Haddow, here to explore her relationship with control with me. Rae and I have actually been working together for almost 5 years. 5 years in December? Six?
Well, six years in October and November. Yeah.
Maybe I looked it up and everything. I'm like 2019. Maybe maybe that's maybe I've shifted software so many times that who knows. I trust
I'm
you
pretty.
over me.
I
My
think it was fall of 2018.
Okay, there we go. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've had a lot of fun together and a lot of opportunity to explore, and I'll put fun in air quotes, but many versions of fun together. And yeah, it's been such a beautiful journey with you, Rae, just to witness how much you've changed and how you've really transformed in so many ways. And I'm so honored to share this journey with you and to be part of your network, part of your guiding systems. And I learned so much from you because a lot of your patterns I can relate to myself. So having that mirrored back to me is always fun. And I really enjoy just, yeah, any session where we dive into the nitty-gritty, and there's always big ahas for me and for you. So thank you for sharing this journey with me.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Yeah, it's been honestly like life changing is the thing for me that has shifted kind of everything I worked up to, and then I find it so interesting. Like I just find diving into it. So I honestly, it's kind of almost, magical to kind of dive into these things and see where it is and see what's going on and just kind of connects all the dots. So I so appreciate our work together and our relationship. Yes.
Beauty. Yeah. I'm in a parking lot and diesel trucks are everywhere. So I'm like a diesel jump just started, but it's far away. So hopefully it's not hurt.
I can't hear it.
The joys of working out of an RV and having all the different sounds. I know there was one episode I filmed where Rio was barking at every ATV that drove by. So it's like, oh, we'll see if the sound gets picked up or not. So,
uh,
yeah.
Funny.
So, how I want to start this conversation is I want to invite you and I into a little exploration, but also anyone who's listening. And I love to keep things simple, and I love to just, look at the physiology and what our human experience is relative to a topic, because I find when we don't have as much content involved in our explorations, we can learn a lot more about ourselves because we're not trying to figure it out. We're just curious of like, oh, when I do this and I notice that, that's interesting. So I want to invite all of us just to notice what shows up at the idea of or in response to this word control. And there's so many layers entangled into control, and we'll get to that in a moment. But I know for me, when I think of control, just in this moment, as I invited us to notice, I had two responses. I first felt myself get small, like in response to power over. I very quickly felt myself like, "Look, small hide." And then I felt the opposite of like, oh, no, take up space. Um, a little bit more of the shift into like have it all together. I feel my shoulders expanding. I feel my voice get a little deeper and more like powerful. Um, so it was really interesting for me to actually notice that very quick, like, "Ugh," and then nope, move into the power over, which is something that's familiar for me.
Yeah, and what I noticed when you said that was just paying attention to what's happening in my body. And mine is mostly like a condensing of my energy into my like core column. I feel the pull in, and it's more of like a battle ready sort of energy, in terms of like being able to hunker down or control how big how big it is, like how big my energy is. So I can feel the the pulling in of extremities is kind of how it feels into
Mm.
that core kind of column. And there's a density to it when we talk about control for me. And it's yeah, it's a hardening or a reducing of the flow of what's happening in my system.
Mm. So what's interesting is like we experience it in different ways, right? And that's what I want to invite other people to notice. If like just use the word control and you chances are you'll have some sort of experience around it. If you're not someone who's used to paying attention to your experience or newer to paying attention to what's happening on the inside or in your human experience, you might be like, whatever, it's just a word. I don't have an experience. But just notice because sometimes just a word gives us enough information for us to get curious about, right? So for you, this pulling inward, right? And for me, this like small, but then get big, right? This gathering
Yeah.
you have, and then yeah, this shift in power that I have.
And I think one of the other things that happens for me that happens in many situations where I'm something like going to some sort of survival mechanism, and I notice it right now, is also the elevation of where my energy center is, like where I feel it. So I'm out of my pelvis and into my chest. And
Yes.
and that's a big one for me is when I'm not in my pelvis, I know there's something else happening. And so that I can feel that also right now when we think
Yeah.
about, or when I listen about control, it's like, oh yeah, and it's up here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's up in my chest.
Yeah. And this is where I find it so helpful to learn about how it is we shift into these patterns, because then when we notice these experiences within ourselves, the sooner we recognize that, the more room there is to kind of play and discover what else is going on. It's such a great indicator, like early stage indicator that something has shifted in my state and I'm moving more into one of my vortexes, one of my patterns, one of my ways of protecting myself or managing, controlling things or distracting myself. So this ability to tune into the subtle shifts that our system makes to me is like game changer when it comes to wanting to change patterns because those early indicators is where we can create change. So,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah. So the other thing I want to invite us all into as we kind of discover a little bit about our relationship to the word control in this moment and how we're responding to the word control is what shows up at the idea of having a little bit less of whatever it was you were experiencing. So for you, this like everything going inward, everything kind of coming upward, this energy that kind of gets condensed. If you imagine doing that a little less, is there anything that shows up for you?
For me, it's kind of a double-edged sword. What shows up is almost an automatic, not automatic, but an immediate lightening of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that gives a little bit more space. There's also a feeling of trepidation,
Mm-hmm.
like just the sensation of like kind of a bit of a waver in the energy in terms of, is this okay? Is this not okay? And I feel that is a shift from where I used to be for sure. But
Yeah.
it's a different thing when I'm like, oh, I can, lighten this a lot. I
Yeah.
have that capacity, but my default has been for a long time that like, whoa.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's how it feels for me, is kind of both of those things now.
Yeah. It's like the old highway exists and the new highway still exists. So it's like, here's the pattern of, whoop, this is how I know how to control all of this. If I gather it all in, and move it upwards, and this may sound like weird gibberish to people, but it's like if we do what our pattern tells us to do, we feel like we're air quote okay. But a little bit less of that gives insight into what we're protecting ourselves from or what we're trying not to feel. So in your old highway, in the old way of, navigating or being in life, it's like that's what was underlying or underneath all the need for control. Whereas now there's a well-established new highway there that's like, oh no, wait, there can be that warble and that wavering, but we're actually okay. There's capacity here. I've integrated into knowing I'm actually okay versus needing control to know I'm okay. Right?
Yeah. And
Yeah.
it's that conscious. There's a bit of a like automatic
Hmm.
from so many years of the default. And
Hmm.
then there's the conscious awareness of like, oh, wait, like the capacity is different now than it has
Yeah.
been
Yeah.
from that default. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. I know for me, when I think of a little less of control, I move back into that vulnerable state that I felt at the very beginning, which is like the get small. So I notice a quiver of fear, a little bit of hypervigilance, a change in my breath, and an anticipation. Like there's an anticipation of something. Whereas when I move back into the control of broadening my shoulders and taking up space, you can hear it in my voice. I'm just like, nope, I'm okay, I'm fine. But a little less of that is like, oh, that's vulnerable. Right? So it's the awareness of what we're doing here is inviting the awareness into why that pattern exists, why we do like to control to avoid feeling these underlying tones that are there within us.
Hmm.
Yeah. So I want to just invite other people to, this might be a very new way to explore for you, but I find that this can be really fascinating because it just gives us insight into more of the pieces that are at play. And what both Rae and I described, for me, that like vulnerable hypervigilance, fear, and for you, that kind of quiver, that's usually a representation of where we are stuck in the threat response cycle, which is something I speak to quite often. And I do a whole episode on it in episode 2. Right? So it's kind of like, oh, we're gathering information on where we're stuck in the threat response cycle, where our trauma exists. And then we now know these patterns that have evolved to protect us to not have to feel the intensity of these places where we're stuck in time, stuck believing that the threat's still happening. So see what those of you that are listening, see what you gather from that exploration, because to me, that can be really juicy to learn more about yourself. And something we didn't talk about at the beginning intentionally was that there are different types of control, right? So some of you may resonate a little bit more with what Rae shared with this gathering in. Some of you may be able to relate to what I described of like power over, right? To me, control shows up in so many different ways. And what I'm attracted to in this conversation, at least, or what jumped out at me for this conversation relative to control, is that there's control as power, right? Which is one of my more familiar, like if I'm in control and have power, I'm perceived as okay because everything's fine. Whereas there can also be control where I control who I am. So I control the way I show up in the room, I control what masks I put on, right? And uh, this kind of intertwines with the next one, which is if I control my environment or control everything outside of me, the situations, everyone else's dynamics that are at play. And if I control that, then I'm okay. So there's these different ways that we use control to maintain a sense of feeling air quote okay, safe enough, um, so that we don't have to feel the depth of the discomfort that comes when we actually lose control or feel like we've lost control. Anything you want to
Yeah.
add to that?
Yeah, just an observation. Like in my experience, all three of those kind of groupings would show up in various ways, but there are definitely ones that for me are much more prevalent in how I interact with control than others. So, you know, you mentioned the power over, that's a small one in my world, but there are little places where I recognize it and I notice that that happens. And then the bigger ones for me are the other two, but that it isn't one way only, right? There's so many ways that we can weave control into how we interact, how we relate, etc. So it is kind of that, like, I think of it as like the bars on a mixing board. You're gonna
Mm,
get some of the, like, some of each, likely, if you're
yeah,
really in tough situations, because they're not all one way or another.
exactly. Exactly. And that this is again why I love paying attention to the experience of ourselves, because then we can notice which one we're kind of leaning towards or which one we perceive as is important in that moment. And I say which one, but 'cause it doesn't need to be which one, but which pattern of ours do we feel ourselves shifting into? And it can be an intertwined uh, gathering of a number of different ways of controlling. Yeah. I mean,
Oh,
like for
the
me,
beautiful creativity of control.
oh, it's so, and the way it's all an illusion, you know?
Yeah, exactly. All of it. It doesn't matter which one
Totally.
of them it
Totally.
is.
Yeah. I know for me, I feel that power over comes in, or for me, it's like, it can come in as like if I'm the teacher, for example, if I'm running a workshop or doing something like that, there can be a subtle flavor of like, whoa, my back gets longer, I take up more space, and I'm in the role of being the professional here, but I'm keeping myself protected and I'm micromanaging the room. And I don't do it in a because I think part of it is who I am, and this is something I want to speak to with our patterns is like part of it is who I am. Like I love to make sure everyone is um I mean, they don't have to be having a good time, but I'm going to be reading the room and adjusting how I'm teaching relative to what's happening in the room. Some of it can be rooted in survival of like, oh, do they like what I'm teaching? Am I making sense? Imposter syndrome stuff, right? So there's this mix of like adjust so that everyone's okay while maintaining this teacher persona, right? And I mean, it's been changing over the years big time.
Yeah,
But that to me is a mix of those control pieces.
totally. And there's some distinction to be made about um I think that the energetic signature of what you're talking about, right? Like there's the control in terms of doing it from a place of protection and a place of trauma. And then there's, like, I would say that is like meeting the room. You
Yeah,
are the leader. You are needing to be the one that is guiding people. You are. So,
yeah,
and to notice where those are and how that shifts and and what happens, right? What happens in your body when you're in a place where you're rooted in your pelvis, or for me,
hmm
when I'm rooted in my pelvis,
hmm
versus, and I'm leading something, and I do have the room, and I do have the attention of people who are there to do something, right? That I am
yeah,
leading, versus it being like that illusion of the control, that I can control what's happening in this
yeah,
room. It's such a
exactly.
different, and even in talking right now, I notice a difference in my voice and a difference
hmm
in where my energy is and a difference, right? So you can, I mean, it's
It's
so
always
dynamic. It's
changing.
always changing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And that I think is where the importance lies. If it's always changing, we can also notice how it's changing. Is it always changing to the same pattern over and over, or is it always changing relative to the change in my environment and those changes are appropriate? Right?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it reminds me of um just something I've been doing for the last 6 years every Monday morning. It's a repetitive thing, and how it's changed and how I lead that community of practice, and the ways in which I feel the difference in like the control versus meeting what comes up and leading the situation. And it's changed so much over that 5 or 6 years.
Cool.
And it's something I can go back, because I record them all. It's something you can go back to and notice, like, just, it's so clear, right? So
Yeah.
that the dynamic nature of how you can become aware of things, and it doesn't always, for me, it hasn't changed quickly, but it's changed a whole lot.
Yeah.
In so many ways, because I'm noticing things differently, and I can show up differently, and I can attend to myself and the room differently based on having more awareness of what's happening in my body.
Yeah. I love you naming that it takes time, and how cool that you have this way to measure the difference. Because sometimes with this work, I find the things change and I feel different, but I can't necessarily name it or pinpoint it, right? So to have that ability to measure it in a way where you're reflecting and you see the difference is so huge. And I actually have a somewhat newer client that I had a session with earlier today, and I can tell like she just wants it different now. Like make all this go away. You know, I'm like, well, it's been 30 years of you navigating life this way. I don't have the magic wand, unfortunately. I'm pretty sure it doesn't exist. And it takes time. And it
Yeah.
takes pausing and noticing, and it takes uh, hard work, right?
And it's the most rewarding thing I have ever done in my
100%.
life.
Yeah.
Like the reward and the benefit and the impact to every part of your life when
Yeah.
you start noticing it. I mean, yes, of course, we want to control it. We want to change it right now, right? I mean, that is part of it as well.
That's, yeah,
And
totally.
it's like, I want this thing to be different than it is.
Yeah.
But as your capacity grows to notice, the noticing in itself lightens up the need for control, or the
Yes.
perceived need for control,
Yeah.
and it shifts. And then you notice, like, oh, this is different. This interaction that I've had 50,000 times is actually different this time than it was last time I remember paying
Yeah.
attention to it. And that's the beauty. I mean, it's such a rewarding thing to be aware of some experience being different than it was before. And I think that's almost like the carrot of, okay, I can let go of a little bit more control because this works. It works.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh,
I'm
this thing
still
works.
surviving. I'm
I'm still,
actually okay.
exactly.
Yeah. Well, I'd love for you to go into a little more detail. Let's start with what you're sharing about, like with, I'm guessing it's work, that over this last 6 years, every Monday there's been, you're showing up this way and how that's changed. Are you able to give us a little example of what feels different, how people respond differently?
Yeah. And so I would say that in that situation, certainly in my professional world, um, my I have been, top achiever, want things to be accurate, want things to be right. I'm a technical expert. And so, like, getting it right is something that I try to control. I have tried to control every aspect of something, because I take responsibility for everything, the controlling the environment, controlling how people perceive me. And um, and I love offering people information and having them receive something and take it away and do something with it. And so I lead a community of practice, and it's for like people across the province. And when I started, I was so nervous. I wanted everybody to know I knew something. because I was brand new in the role, and I over prepared. And when anything would go, so when let me just kind of pause there for a second. So when I would lead this community of practice, I would be, my whole body would be jittering, and I would be speaking really quickly, and I would script everything, even though I knew the content. And one of the things a colleague who happens to be a musician as well noted, because we're friends, he said, your voice gets really high when you're in this place, and when we talk to each other normally, your voice drops quite a lot lower. And it would just be like almost frantic energy. It'd just be buzzing off of, like, inside of me. And I would be sweating and, just wanting everything to be perfect. And as I've been able to notice that, there's been a shift in recognizing that I can't control the perception. I can't control how people receive things, and that my ability to meet questions, my ability to be confident, those sorts of things is it's deeper, I guess, now than it ever used to be. And now I show up and it's so much more fluid. And the ability to have questions asked, for example, has shifted a whole lot, because if I don't know, I don't know. It's not, it's not pointing out that I'm not capable of my job or anything like that. So I think in terms of my experience in that, it's become something that I get to participate in more than just being a show for the people who are paying attention. And I don't lose sleep over every Monday morning anymore.
Thank goodness.
And it's been so incremental, because it's, every week all winter, and just looking at the energy that comes across and the confidence that comes across, and how I feel now in leading this sort of conversation with people, with colleagues, with professionals, is just so different than it was when I started.
Yeah.
In 2018.
And some might say, like, oh, well, it's because you have experience, or, over time of doing it, of course it changes. But what I'm hearing and what you're sharing is, yes, that I'm sure contributes, right? Things get easier over time. But what I'm hearing is your ability to navigate any sort of dynamic where you're doing a presentation, or where you have to be in front of a group or a colleague and have more challenging conversations, or that there's more capacity in all ranges. It's not just the thing you're always doing on Monday.
And I think there's a piece for me that I've been noticing a lot lately, and even really noticing in the last several weeks, is how I notice it, how I feel it, is what used to be a rigidity, like this is how I need to approach this, or I'm responsible for all of these things. That was a big one for me. It's like, I control everything because I also feel responsible for everything. And so there's this needing to cover every single base, and there's like this rigidity because you're bouncing between, you're just like, there's so many things to keep track of, versus recognizing and feeling the capacity to meet whatever the next thing is, even if you don't know what it's going to be. And there's a suppleness to that, and there's a flowing dynamic to that, and there's an ability to see how you fit into a larger picture, rather than it feeling like you're on the spot all the time. And I don't know exactly how to kind of tie all that to the control, but it is, for me, it's trying to control, I guess maybe trying to control the situation and control how people see me. I have to be in control of every aspect of that, versus I can meet this, I can show up this way. It's not all my responsibility. I have a lot to offer, and there are places that I won't be able to offer anything. And I think that that dynamic also then just offers so much more in terms of what you can contribute and how you can show up, because in the moment, because you're like, okay, this moment I can meet this. I'm rooted. My energy is like, I'm regulated. I'm doing okay. And then the next moment, this moment, I'm regulated. I'm doing okay. Here's what I can offer. And that shift has been really big, because the rigidity for me is also brittle, versus this suppleness and this ability to flow. There's so much capacity to kind of expand and contract as needed in a situation.
Yeah, well, what you're describing is having capacity, right? If we think of the window of tolerance or the window of capacity, really what you're describing is the ability to be within your window and adapt to the always changing environment that you are exposed to, right? That's you in your window. That's you with a pretty big window, right? Where a lot of people live is outside of that window in what's called the faux window of capacity or tolerance. And that's where we're actually surviving our way with patterns. And we actually can't really adapt to the ongoing changes in our environment. We can only do what we know how to do, which in this context is like to have control. If I have the control of the situation, everything's okay, right? I'm in my faux window and it might look like I have it all together. But ultimately, yeah, right? Sure, a few hands could go up there. But ultimately, if you got thrown a curveball, you wouldn't know how to navigate it.
No.
And what you're describing is the ability to navigate any of it. Well, any of it is a big word, but a lot of it relative to what you have capacity for. Right?
And that, I think that's a big thing, right? Because it causes, when you're in that, and I'll use your term, the faux window, you look like you can handle things, as long as everything is exactly like you expect it to be, and it fits in your box. And if a curveball comes your way, like, things can shatter, and you can just be completely incapable of navigating it, and it just causes such a big thing. And I mean, I look at my history from even just as an adult, right? As the last, whatever, I will say, from like late teens to now, or looking at 25 years or whatever, how controlled everything was at my late teens, early 20s, and how that shifted to be able to be where I am. Like, things were so brittle in that kind of faux window. And I mean, if you were to ask people around me, I had everything handled and under control. Right? That's
Yeah. You were fine. You
I
were
was
fine.
fine. And man, I was so effective and
Yeah.
so efficient.
Yep.
And you could count on me because I would be able to do it. And inside, it was a constant, like just complete chaos of energy inside my body.
Yeah, exactly. And I have a feeling a lot of people can relate to that, where it looks like you have it all together, but ultimately, the image that often gets put to that is you're a duck floating on the river or on the lake, and your feet underneath are just like, you're swimming upstream and your feet are moving like crazy, but you look all calm and relaxed.
Yeah, totally. Totally. I mean, and I think until I started doing this work, I didn't even know that there was another way, like completely looking, cool as a cucumber on the outside and absolutely frantic and bouncing all over the place, buzzing on the inside, right? And I didn't even know there was any other way to feel. Because I'm like, I can control this. I can control the external view that people see, and they don't even have to know what's going on.
Exactly.
Inside.
And I want to get to like the history of that or kind of what shaped that in a second. But before we go there, I want to also speak to how self-care can become part of the controlling to make sure you maintain this as a cucumber vibe, right? Because to me, self-care is so big right now. And what I find people are more commonly doing is using self-care as a coping strategy or a resource, but it's not actually supporting the system to move into more regulation. It's just a temporary thing that supports some settling to happen or for you to stay more connected with yourself. But very quickly, you move back into those patterns you find yourself in. So I'd love for you to share even how your relationship with self-care has changed over the years, because there's been, using self-care to keep yourself cool as a cucumber, and then your relationship with it changing because self-care, of course, is important.
Mm-hmm.
And where are we doing it from?
Yeah, and I mean that is one of the things that I've learned with and from you is that the way I used to see self-care was kind of backing myself off the cliff is kind of, that's kind of what it was. So, okay, whether it's walking to dissipate energy or whether it's like, so exercise for me or having a bath or like the things that people consider self-care, I often, it was often an outlet to dissipate energy. That was kind of the nature of what it was for me. Um, and yes, like, the sleep and trying to eat well and exercising, I mean, they're all good for you.
Mm-hmm.
And the way I used them was like to back myself off
Yeah.
back down because I also didn't have any, I think in lots of ways, I was really scared of actually feeling the whole thing because I had no idea what the like what feeling that might be like, right?
Yeah.
Thinking I would get swamped by it in general, or that I would unravel. And self-care now for me looks a whole lot different than taking care of what I might consider like physical needs or just physical sorts of things in terms of energy. It, I mean, a lot of what I work with now is is feeling what's happening. I mean, that's a big self-care thing for me, right? Is
Pausing and noticing.
pausing and noticing.
Yeah.
And even right now in that moment, the saying pausing and noticing, I could feel a shift in my body. And for me, a lot of that is in writing. You know, I write a lot and process to help feel what's going on. But there's the whole, well, I say the whole experience of just experiencing what you're experiencing without a need to change it, without a need to figure out what it is. I think that is probably one of the biggest things, is not having to figure out what's happening. And in terms of caring for myself, it's about trusting what I'm noticing and trusting that there's a really good reason for it, and that I'm not judging every single experience that I'm having. It's that this thing is here for communication, for information, and how I think I have a lot more compassion for myself, and that is kind of a way in which I can make space for what's happening.
Yeah.
And I think that making space for what's happening, like as much as that sounds like a simplistic, overly simple self-care thing, I actually think that's probably one of the harder things to do, is make room for things to just be what they are.
Yes.
And to not be trying to evaluate what's going on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and what happens through pausing and noticing and giving space for what's happening, it allows you to learn more about yourself, but what it also allows is us to listen more to, like, well, what is it I need, or what are my instincts, or my intuition, what's my intuition telling me, right? And it brings me back to, like, self-care practices like food, like exercise, like journaling, right? It's like it comes from a different place where it's like I'm clearer on what I want to eat, or I know that I want to exercise. It's coming from a very different quality than when it's like I have to exercise.
Yeah. And I
Or
think
my end of the
actually,
spectrum is like, fuck it, I'm not exercising. Don't tell me what to do. Don't tell me to eat good food. I like my sugar, right? Like, other end of the spectrum. Um, but I think that's important to recognize, is like the more we learn to listen, the more we learn to listen where the information's coming from.
and I think it's important to differentiate here too, is like the learning to listen. Before I started this sort of work, I didn't actually pay attention to anything below my head. So there's
I remember
so
that.
much communication coming that,
Uh-huh.
like, when we talk about food, for example, like, am I full?
Uh-huh.
I was thinking about whether I was full, but I wasn't listening to the physical sensations of my body. And I think that is fully connected to the self-care, is that it's not my brain thinking about the thing that
Mm-hmm.
is caring for me. It's my body communicating what's happening and what it needs. And so I think that's huge in terms of the sense, like, talking about the sensation. We can talk about the sensation, but often, like for me, I could talk very eloquently about what I thought was happening, like what I thought I was feeling, what I thought my body was telling me. But it isn't always a language thing. It isn't always a thinking thing. It isn't always something that you can you can't always believe what your brain's telling you, what your mind's
Mm-hmm.
telling you. And your body has such a deeper wisdom in terms of sharing its experience and what it needs and what it requires in the moment that your brain can't
Exactly.
or your mind can't necessarily do. It's like a secondary interpretation.
Yeah, exactly. And that takes time. Learning to listen to that takes time because a lot of the time, if we're disconnected from our body, A, we're not taught how to listen to our body, and B, usually we're disconnected from our body's experiences because it's perceived as too much. So the system has learned to disconnect because why would I feel these experiences of fear and panic and terror and whatever may be at the core of it all?
And I think because we're taught that, or my experience of being taught like big feelings are dangerous in some way, I actually, there were times where I didn't actually know if I'd survive the big feelings. Like I actually thought they'd take me out.
Yep.
And then as I built my capacity in my system to just feel a sensation without labeling it anything, that has kind of shifted the self-care piece too, because I know that my body has the capacity to
Mm.
feel the whole thing. And when I feel the whole thing, it shifts my entire physiology very quickly. But it's
Yes.
also, it really, like I move through it so much more quickly, and the panic is gone and the energy is settled, and like it just is that in
Because,
itself, feeling it is self-care, because then I'm
yes.
not dealing with the panic and I'm not dealing with the anxiety of feeling the feeling. and
Yeah.
and yeah.
And what you're describing again is you in your window, able to navigate these more challenging experiences relative to what's coming up, right? And you move through them
Mm.
versus just getting pulled over into your vortexes and being stuck in or shut down and disconnected from,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
It really is about building our capacity to feel more and actually move through it. And yeah, it's so powerful when because it's an ongoing,
Yeah, forever and ever.
yeah, as we continue to build our capacity and our ability to be with our experiences. Something that stood out to me in what you shared, because I have a feeling a lot of people can resonate with this, is like the fear of crumbling at the idea of losing control. And right, we wove in self-care, and this can show up in so many different ways. It's like if I don't do my exercise, I'm going to crumble. If I don't eat well, I'm going to crumble. I'm going to fall apart, right? If I don't keep everything in control and keep myself in this routine, I'm going to crumble. And I want to name that because I have a feeling a lot of people can resonate with this controlling things, and then this I want to invite people to recognize like you're not alone in the fear of crumbling with the idea of losing control.
No.
Um,
And that everything's going to fall apart, right?
yeah,
Like I think there's this feeling that your whole world is going to fall apart if
yeah,
you lose
yeah,
control, and
yeah,
that every bad thing in the world could happen if you lose control.
yeah.
And I think that's the illusion part, is that you
Yep.
have control and that everything's going to fall down around you if you
Yeah,
don't.
I love that you got fireworks on the video. And that Zoom, your cues are on point. Now, what I want to weave into now is like the reason why we perceive this need for control and fear of crumbling things falling apart is usually rooted in how we developed our upbringing. These patterns are likely very old and perceive that the danger that we experienced then is still happening. The need for control then is still needed now. So I'd love if you're open to sharing a little bit of like, how were the ways you learned to survive at a very young age that is represented by control? And again, I want to invite people listening to reflect on your own way you navigated family dynamics, school, friends, and how it was you learned to maintain a sense of control, whether that's power over or control the situation and the environment or control who you are. Those are the three I've named. There's many other branches off of that. And like we said, they all intertwine. But yeah, do you want to share a little on how you learned to navigate life?
Yeah. I think, as we were kind of discussing before we started, the kind of three main groups that we're talking about of control right now, I did not have the power over growing up. That was not the thing that I had. That was a parental role. And but what I could control and how I tried to control the dynamics within my family and the really, I think the emotional regulation of my family was controlling everything that I thought I had control over. So controlling the environment, controlling how I was perceived, and how that showed up for me is taking responsibility for everything and controlling how people controlling kind of trying to control the things that might impact someone's emotional state. And so a lot of it for me was trying to be perfect, trying to get everything right. Like that if I got everything right, that somehow that would keep the peace and there wouldn't be this throwing around of the power over. And so that showed up in ways of managing my siblings' behavior. It showed up in making sure that he fit within boxes that I thought were things that would keep us safe. It showed up in being exceptionally helpful and not having needs. It showed up in being an excellent student who paid attention, who teachers liked, at this agreeable, compliant, helpful sort of child who was considered mature for her age because I didn't act out. I was the good kid, never late for curfew, all of those things, and how that felt for me was there was zero room for error, and I always felt like it was never quite there, never quite good enough. There was a hamster wheel sort of situation where it was just like the next thing, and it was and the thought of losing control, even though obviously he didn't really have control, but the thought of not controlling things felt really, dangerous to me in a lot of ways, that I would not know how to navigate something if I couldn't control it. And I think it was really hard on me in lots of ways. It was really hard on relationships, like friends. It was hard with friends because I also tried to like control how everybody saw me and control by being helpful. So I was always like doing things for other people. I was always never like I wasn't able to receive things. It was just like I had to always give people things or show that I was useful. So there was this always conditional nature to relationships, and it was a big struggle, and yet I never felt like I had any control ever.
Yeah.
Right. Like,
yeah. On reflection, you can see it was control, but at the time, it was just what you had to do to survive, to not crumble, to not fall apart, to not have things blow up.
Yeah. And I think to feel like I think in at I mean, obviously now a different language than I ever would have had, and different perspective, but I think control was my way of feeling like I had some agency as well. Like
Yes. Yeah.
I could influence this thing that I didn't have influence over. And so that I think was like this connection to some sort of agency, some sort of um, reference point that might feel like I had some um, influence over a situation I didn't have any real, ability to change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I want to invite people that resonate with what you're saying, because I have a feeling there's a few, to just notice what it's like to reflect on that. Like, and something I feel is really important in that is like, that's what you perceived you had to do.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And this is where, as we get older, we run into conflict with ourselves because it's like, that's what you had to do. And then as you get older and you're like, well, I don't want to do these things anymore. This is exhausting. And I feel alone, or I feel like, you know, I want deeper relationships, but I don't know how. I can't trust. I'm waiting for the shoe to drop all the time. Right. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and I want this to be different. And I'm trying so hard to show up differently. But this is so deeply rooted in having to have survived all that time that no wonder you may still want some control as an
Mm-hmm.
adult, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that these patterns continue to take shape in everything that we do. And something I'm an advocate for is like, how do we recognize these patterns to recognize their intention and the purpose that they served, still perceiving to serve that purpose, so that there can be more of an understanding of why we navigate life the way we do, instead of being so hard on ourselves and frustrated and annoyed and just wanting it all to be different right now. It's like, well, the things you're frustrated with are there because without them, you perceived that things would blow up, things would
Yeah.
crumble,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, for
So just
sure.
to create that space a little bit to reflect on these patterns you find yourself in now, to see their history and to see the impact that they had then.
And I think that like giving yourself, and this is something I found really valuable for me, is having just that even this at the beginning, the slightest ability to give myself a little bit of grace around why I behaved or continued to behave in a way that feels, I mean, it feels yucky
Mm-hmm.
often, right? Like it
Mm-hmm.
just doesn't feel good,
Yeah.
but you keep doing these things, and to just be able to give yourself grace and recognize it's there for a reason. I mean, it
Yeah.
was there for a reason. And that's something I think in creating the space to be aware of a pattern, it also just allows you a little bit of and I'll call it breathing room
Mm-hmm.
to get a little bit different perspective on, okay, I'm doing this thing again, and I recognize that this thing has served me in these ways in the past, and maybe there's another way. Even just the question, maybe there's another way,
Yeah.
and being able to notice the, like, kind of get down to it in a granular way, that this little tiny thing actually gives you a path into the pattern or into the what's going on.
Totally. Totally. And I want to name that the more we know what those patterns, how those patterns supported us, the easier it is to create space. Sometimes we don't know yet, what the intention of the patterns are. We don't know what's at the core of it all. And it can take some time to tease it all apart and find that. Um, and that's where, I have a little bit of a like around acceptance, because we can try to have acceptance for our patterns, but
Yeah,
until we genuinely understand that it's not an embodied acceptance and grace and space, it's just this, overriding.
which
bypassing
Yeah, which I think
acceptance.
like that for me, part of how I get there is the journaling part because it is a physiological experience for me. And
Yes.
so I can tell when I am like, oh, there is a shift here. And but yeah, I mean to just say, I'm good with this, it
Yeah.
doesn't really matter. Your
I
body is
get
like
that. That's why I
like
do this because it's from my history.
like
I
like
accept
my
that.
body is not it's not on the same page yet. Like we have
Yeah.
to actually like feel and process what's happening in our
Yeah.
physical system, or I do anyways.
Yeah. And the more we do that, the easier it is to create the space, the easier it is also to go more to the root in the trauma that we're stuck in and to transform and move through that. And then the pattern is needed less and less and less. And that's where, again, I want to invite people to recognize what in our patterns is part of who we are
Mhm.
versus it's rooted in survival, right? You and I are both like, we love to teach and gather people together and share our perspectives and offer people into their own experiences. And that's part of who we are, right? And then, yes, we can both do it from ways where we're trying to control or maintain a certain persona, right? So it's like notice the
Totally.
flavors in which this is my ongoing practice. Notice the flavors in which I'm showing up in.
Totally. And I think and for me there's always an energetic signature that like I can feel the difference of my natural personality to lead and teach versus the mask of being the leader, right?
Yes.
There's like a I'm going to be this way or I'm going to do this thing or I'm going to have you see me as this versus I'm leading in a natural way and there's a different and I think you have to feel that. Like I think when you do that, you can feel it. I don't know if we can explain it very easily, but there
No,
is a
but you,
difference and you can
yeah,
feel the difference.
exactly. Exactly. That's what's most important. Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
Well, I feel like we could keep talking about a number of things. Is there anything else you want to dip into around control? Otherwise,
Um, I think one of the things that I had been thinking about prior to us like having this discussion was how there are, I would say, like degrees of control. And I mean that in a way that like I would say my relationship with control has has shifted a lot. It's evolved a lot. And and there are still places that I notice that are a healthier, I will say a healthier way that I still like to exert control, right? To feel some of that agency, to feel like I've got something, some anchor. And I've been really curious about that in terms of even just navigating how it shows up and being generous with myself and giving myself grace on um, like things going the way I think they should because I'm doing all the right things, and then them
mm,
not going the way
hmm
I think they should, right?
hmm
And just the curiosity around that and just bringing that into the conversation more as an inquiry, but in what ways do we still try to exert control, maybe in I'll say better in air quotes, right? Like in ways that are less destructive, less harmful to ourselves, less dysregulating, but how does it show up and where can you soften and where can I soften? And one of the things for me recently has been recovering from surgery and been following all the protocols and doing all the things I'm supposed to be doing. And I still can't control how my body is recovering. And I noticed the other day, it's like, I'm doing everything right. Why is this not going exactly like I think it should be going? I'm going, oh,
hmm
this is a control thing. I want to control this outcome because, and I'm getting annoyed by doing everything right and not having the outcome I expect. And so just and then it gives some like adds some levity and adds some maybe humor to the situation. Oh, I'm still trying to control this, right?
Exactly.
And I just think that ability to bring in like a little bit of humility into the whole
A
situation and be
hundred
like,
percent.
what is happening here? Because I can feel this energy again of like, this isn't how this is supposed to be because I've done everything I'm supposed to. And then being like, okay, again, how do I get back into that place of meeting what comes, doing all the things I think I need to do, but meeting what comes, right? So
Yes.
that
Yeah.
it's that flow of like I can control how I show up in lots of ways and I can have influence in what I do to support myself and how I interact with people, but I can't control the outcome.
Hmm.
And that recognition in an ongoing way with myself, but like within myself, like my healing, but also with other people helps again create more space, helps again create more even capacity to, grin at yourself and smirk a little bit
Yes.
about, oh,
Yeah.
right, I'm trying
Yeah.
to control this situation.
Yes.
And and I think it for me will probably be an ongoing, dance for my whole life
Yeah.
with control. And it's way easier now, that dance.
Totally. I love that you name that because I feel like so many of us, myself included, hold on to expectations. It's the attachment or the assumption of expectations. And I can relate that's been shifting big time for me, especially around my business. Like, I used to try, well, I didn't try very hard, but I wanted or had this perception of wanting to really grow my business and have it be this and that. And now I have very little, I'll say very little because there's still layers there, attachment to the outcome. And
Mhm.
that shift in the the need of an outcome or the expectation of an outcome just makes it so much more playful and there's more room for like,
There's so
yeah,
much more room for the creativity and the
yeah,
possibility and the potential to be there because you're not like this is what it has to be or this is what
yeah,
where I'm aiming it then that is that increased capacity to meet what is there in this moment and to
exactly.
notice what what the what the best answer is in the moment, not the right answer, but that okay, this is how I'm going to meet this piece. And it
Yeah,
just opens so much more because the possibility is there rather than like that rigidity and control and the expectation of this is the thing that will get me there. But
yeah,
there could be 50 million things that get you there,
yeah,
right? So I think like that has been and I think expectations are so hard and they are a control
totally.
piece, right? It's like,
Which which then also impact our ability to listen to what is really
yeah,
there and
there,
easy for us to the path for us to follow. It's like we get in our
exactly.
own way with the
Yeah,
control, you know,
exactly.
from listening
And we
again.
think that it's going to and we have this naive, and I don't even know if it's naive, but like this it's like you can think about one thing and then you still on the other side are like, but this is how I'm going to get there. Like controlling this entire situation and every
Yeah.
aspect of this is how I'm going to get there when the evidence points to the opposite, right?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So all the more reason to ongoingly pause and notice and
Yeah.
learn to connect more with the language of the bigger picture that's at play here.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it. Well, hopefully those listening have lots of ahas. I know I can relate to so much of what we talked about, and I know many of the people that in my programs and in my one-on-ones navigate so many similar experiences. So I'm so grateful for you for coming on here and sharing your experiences of this and how things are different. And again, like it's so cool to feel you so deeply connected with yourself and listening from such a different place, and to also see how that's unfolding your life in such a different way. Like the way you live life now, it's just, again, it's like there's flow instead of that rigid control,
Mhm.
right? And I look forward to continuing to see how this flow impacts the ongoing evolution of you.
Well, thank you so much. I thoroughly enjoy talking with you. So this is lovely to just have kind of a conversation about control, and even in doing so, having, anchoring the recognition of how far I've come, how much things have shifted, how my relationship with control is so much different than it used to be. So thank you for inviting me to this conversation. It's
Yeah.
joyful. I have a big smile on my face.
Same. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks so much, Rae.
Thanks.
Thanks so much for listening. I hope that this episode has provided you with new perspectives and insights. And if you haven't already, head to my website to download the experiential guide. Until the next time, I invite you to continue to pause and notice.